Hey, what's up? I hope you're doing well tonight. This is going to be another mailbag installment that I could have sworn to Christ I had answered this at some point, but strangely enough, going back through the mailbag videos, I literally was unable to go and find the response, I guess. So I'm going to be going ahead and doing another, I guess, answering of this specific set of questions in detail. So, I have multiple projects that I am a part of and stuff. A lot of it revolves around gaming, more specifically, getting older PC games to go and work on newer hardware. And I've been doing it for a while, well over, 15 years, and for the most part, I've actually enjoyed it. The games that I had started to go and work on with modern hardware was quite literally the PC ports of the Resident Evil franchise as well as Silent Hill. So when you kind of throw yourself out there past a certain point, people will eventually start to dig into your life a little bit and they'll figure out, hey, you've worked on this, this, and this, that's so cool. And then the inevitable question will pop up of, why don't you do this anymore? How come we don't see you in the community anymore? What happened? And so I try to keep my YouTube existence very isolated. I have it branched out to like two social medias, and that's it, and that's about as far as I took it. I don't really talk about it in real life or anything like that. It's always been a very private hobby. And I do that because I like to keep my private life and I guess what would be deemed my public life separate. I don't view myself as any sort of influencer or anything like that. I don't really view myself as anybody important. I'm just kind of out here doing my own thing and learning as I go. So I was questioned because I have somebody that watches these videos and stuff. They recognize my voice from various other chats that I've been a member of and everything. And so finally, I was asked, how come we don't see you in the Resident Evil and Silent Hill communities anymore? And I think it's been kind of a long time coming, per se. Like, I've been working on these projects for so long that it's unreal. I have a tendency to not really talk about my personal life as much, or really at all, for that matter. And I just kind of go, I have my projects, and I have a couple of older screen names that are still in use, but largely a while back I had transitioned everything over to just Raime. So it's kind of a multi-tiered answer, I think, going and actually thinking about it now. I didn't stop loving the communities. I think with Resident Evil and Silent Hill, I had enjoyed both of them immensely, but what had actually killed the community involvement for me was the takeover of influencers, I think. And so we're going to go ahead and start with Resident Evil, and we're going to go over to Silent Hill because I had separate existences for each, because they're both very different flavorings of survival horror. So for a long time I was a code contributor for the PC ports for Resident Evil, getting them running on newer hardware and stuff, because a lot of people did not want to go and get a PlayStation. A lot of people didn't really want to resort to piracy. A lot of people really just kind of wanted to sit there and say, hey, I'm playing this old game on my computer, and then possibly introduce things like mods and everything else to it. So for a while I had sat back and I had realized that the PC ports for Resident Evil were actually quite bad. Like, they were just riddled with tons and tons of bullshit because Capcom has never done any of the PC ports well, in my opinion. They were always riddled with issues, and, so I was, at the time when I had started, I was just learning how to do base grade programming and things like that. And so I would go and I would kind of flex my knowledge all the time, things that I had learned, and by going and patching these games, and it was a little bit of an ego hit, I think, looking back now. I was a lot younger, and I was way more arrogant. And so I would go and I would be like, okay, it runs, this is cool. And I would never really release these patches to the public. It would always be, oh hey, I've got friends that want to play these games, I've got family members that want to play these games, and it's cool that I can actually go and make a tiny little patch to actually go and fix a lot of this, and I was really happy with that for a while. This had gone on for years. Years and years and years. It was definitely a private thing. And I had eventually gotten to a point where I was sharing it with the community, and this is around the time we were trying to go and get Resident Evil any of them, to run on dual-core processors, but the problem that we had at the time was that they would run too fast, or they simply wouldn't run at all. There was also various discrepancies with the OSs being used in compatibility mode and just everything. It was just kind of a hell of a thing. And so, at this point, I went from making patches privately to going and releasing them publicly because I wanted people to go and enjoy these games. I didn't want them to kind of disappear into the void, and to be lost to time. Like I was seeing a lot of games around this time, like a lot of the older games were just kind of vanishing without any form of emulation because the hardware would start to fall apart and rot, and cartridges would start to quite literally just malfunction, fail, and then the ones that were left were normally really expensive. And so I kind of viewed it as a form of preservation. A lot of people liked it because it gave them accessibility to play it on PC. And then there was also people that were getting into making randomizers and mods and everything else for them. But I kind of wanted to just go and preserve the games. And so that was the whole point of these patches. I said to myself, oh, they don't have, a proper OS to run it, or they don't have a proper card to go and run it. And so I would just kind of sit there and I would say, okay, let's go ahead and bring these games into a new generation, more or less. I was watching a lot of the younger generations at the time get super wrapped up in it, and they were super excited, and so I would try to bring these games into a new era. All the Resident Evils and the Silent Hill PC ports received this treatment because I enjoy both franchises a lot. I am a fan, and I wanted to go and make these games accessible to kids that did not have a console to play them on. So I said, okay, we're going to go ahead and do this. And so there was a fair bit of popularity for a while. I would kind of go and keep that section of my life just kind of detached. And I would just say, I wouldn't even use my name at the time, back when I was still presenting as male. I would just say, hi, and I would use my old screen name. I've got update blah 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 ready to go, this is what it's fixing, and this is what it introduces. And so that was my life for a really long time, throughout high school, college, all that mess, really. And so I was really, really happy with it because I was saying to myself, now people can just sit down and enjoy this. And so I think YouTube is ultimately... YouTube and its influencers is ultimately what kind of killed the fandom for me a fair bit, because back then, before YouTube, we would all kind of congregate in various forums and we would talk to each other, and a lot of the times the conversations were incredibly civil and it was really, really lovely. We could sit around and we could talk about our love for the game. We didn't really have a lot of brain rot kind of floating around. We could just sit down, enjoy ourselves, talk about the game, and talk about things we liked, things we didn't like. It was a really, really lovely experience that I remember very fondly. When people had started deciding that they wanted to try to be influencers on YouTube, it was almost problematic immediately. Anytime you have people that want to be pseudo-celebrities or people that think that they speak for the entire community, it is always very, very problematic. And I had noticed this very early on. you know. I'm a little bit stranger than most, I think. I don't exactly get starstruck, per se. Like, if somebody becomes popular, I honestly don't care. I don't really care if somebody becomes popular. I don't really care if I'm popular. I don't really give a shit what people have a tendency to think of me, unless it's outwardly hostile and somebody's trying to kill me. At that point, I pay attention to it very quickly. But in terms of people's opinions of me, I just don't care. I never really have. You know, not so much in a, you know, these people are beneath me sort of way. Like, I don't feel that at all. It's more of a, I'm living my life. I'm not bothering anybody. Fuck off. Leave me alone. So that's how it was for a while. I just kind of, I would look at it and I would say, oh, geez. So a lot of these people would start to pop out of the woodwork. And these are people that I would not remember from the forums at all. You know, like, they had never seen a forum a day in their life. Most of these people would claim that they'd been playing the franchise for a while, but I would kind of look at them and I would kind of raise an eyebrow a little bit. And so eventually it had hit a point where most of the people that were going and discovering these games would eventually try them out on PC. And that would eventually lead to them not being able to run it, even with compatibility modes and various other things, which would eventually lead them to needing a patch, which would eventually lead them to me, and I didn't really care for that too much. My patches would have a tendency to circulate on their own, and at the time I still had Twitter, where I would go and post my patch updates. I would just sit there and say, okay, hey, this is live, this is where you can go and get it, you know. Go ahead and grab it over from GitHub, you know, you're doing alright. And so it was really weird because a lot of these people would go and they would want to go and play the game on PC, but they wouldn't really want to put in any sort of actual work, so I would have to stop, take time, and explain how all this mess works, explain how to replace assets, install the patch, just literally everything. And it was kind of, well, it was fucking interesting, to say the least, because one thing I learned very, very quickly is that publicly they behave one way, privately it is a whole different fucking ballgame. And so for me, I kind of looked at it as being incredibly disingenuous, but I was at the time, the guy that was going and doing the patches, and all these people would want to go and, like, play this game. So eventually it went from me going and saying, okay, this is how you do this, in a long spiel of text, like a setup manual, if you would, to saying, okay, I'm just going to show you how to do it, and just give them tons and tons of help until it ran. And so it kind of makes you a little bit popular when you're the person that can go and get all this old stuff running so they can go and make content, more or less. And I was like, okay, you know, this will eventually fizzle out and stuff. I thought it would be dead in a couple of weeks, but this had started to go on for years and years and years. And I didn't really like that too much. I'm very much so a fan of being in my own space. And I just kind of prefer to be in my space, stay in my space. I don't like bothering other people. I don't really like people bothering me. If they need help, I'll give them a hand, but I didn't really like all of the popularity that going and making patches was going and giving me. It was taking me out of my comfort zone, and I didn't really care for that too much because I just preferred to, well, be by myself, and that's okay. So I would eventually, some influencers would try to shove me in their cliques that they would have. And I saw this pretty heavily with the Resident Evil cliques that I would see, especially those that would do like retrospectives and stuff. I would just kind of sit there and they'd be like, hey, you know, let's hang out, let's go do this. And I really just didn't like it that much. I would just kind of say to myself, I'd rather be at home doing something, you know, and I didn't really, for me, that was pretty much it. But they would go, and I wouldn't want to be rude, so if people go and invite me to something, even though I wouldn't want to really be there, I would still kind of show up to be like, hey, you know, thank you for inviting me, here I am. I don't really like to be an asshole about things, you know, even if it does kind of take me out of my comfort zone a little bit. So I would start past a certain point rubbing elbows with a lot of influencers, and I was disillusioned with what I saw very quickly. It was nothing personal, I just saw how they operated, and I was not impressed with any of it. I love the Resident Evil and the Silent Hill fan bases. I love talking to them about the story, I love just every aspect of it, gameplay, the whole nine yards. And that's pretty much where my heart is with the community. I love talking about all of it, I love helping people with things, I love getting them into the fandom, you know? Like, I don't push them into it, but, like, if somebody comes up and they're like, oh, hey, I'm kind of nervous about this, I'm like, hey, man, not a problem. Tell you what, this is how we're going to handle this. You know, this is where you need to start. These are the games that are super good. You know, this is what order you should play them in, things like that. And so that was pretty much what I would do in both fandoms. I was very welcoming. I used to do the same thing for Monster Hunter as well, because Monster Hunter was very unapproachable until World had come out. And so it was really weird for me because I would be invited to events and stuff, or sometimes I would be invited to go and hang out, and I just wasn't really impressed with anything that I would see. I realized very quickly that it was a lot of lying, bullshitting, sexism, homophobia, transphobia, just all sorts of stuff, and I would go and I would stare at it. And I would realize very quickly that a lot of these people are very disingenuous. I would also learn very quickly that aside from their fandom, there's not really much of a human being there. And that had bothered me quite a bit. I would sit down and they would just talk about the game, but it wouldn't be like normal socializing where you're kind of like, oh, this is what I like, this is what I don't like. They would kind of obsess over it a fair bit, and then there would also be a fair bit of lying involved with it as well, and I would just kind of sit there and I would raise an eyebrow a lot of the time, and I would just kind of watch what they would do. Like, a lot of the time when I would show up to these events, I literally would not say anything. I would say jack shit, and that was pretty much it. And I would observe how they treated each other, what they talked about, how they reacted to things. I wouldn't really say much, but I would just watch. I would just observe. And I realized very, very quickly that most of these people that a lot of the community looks up to, that have kind of taken over the fan base a little bit, a lot of the influencers, are actually really fucking awful human beings. And I would just kind of sit there and look at them and say, this is the life you live. And so people were really unnerved, I think, by how quiet I can get. I'm pretty quiet by nature, you know. But I would just kind of sit there and I would look at all the dumb shit that they would lie about, and I would just be like, you know, you could do better than this, quite literally. So, but when you're the person that patches the games and helps everybody get everything running and stuff, you know, when you're quote-quote the guy, you know, it was something that you couldn't really very easily refuse. Because one person leads to another person, which leads to another person, and, you know, it just kind of daisy chains, I think, from there. And so it was really wild, because publicly they would kind of go and try to maintain some semblance of normalcy, and it was all the networking that you would expect, you know, like, these people aren't friends, but they would say, oh, this is my good friend, or, you know, so-and-so. These people wouldn't really hang out with each other. It would just be, oh, I need your help for this video, and, you know, rinse, dry, repeat. You know, it's kind of that social climbing that we would see a lot of the time, and I didn't really like that too much. I thought it was really fucked up. It was incredibly dishonest with pretty much every fucking facet of their being. And so, I would go and I would look at these events, and I would kind of play them back in my head a fair bit, and I would look at how they behaved, I would look at, like, the sexism, the racism, the homophobia, just everything, and I would say to myself, God damn, these are not people I want to be around. And so, there was a point in time where I was sitting on a couch, and they were all talking about YouTube in general, and it was, really just kind of a bullshit conversation. to be having to begin with, because a lot of them were like, well, if I go and get X views, I can go and start making money on this and this and this. And it was a lot of complaining about, either how something wasn't making enough money, not getting enough views. It was very business centric. And so I kind of understood it a little bit, and then as this went on, it had gotten kind of stranger, because when people get comfortable, like overly comfortable, they lie more. And so I had sat down, and I was watching them talk to each other, and I think Resident Evil was coming up on, oh fuck, I think it was like damn close to like 22 or 23 years of life. And one of the other influencers was literally just kind of sitting down next to another influencer that she was talking to, and she was like, yeah, I remember when, this game came out. The problem is the game was 23, she was 21. And so I just kind of sat here and I stared. And, I did the mental math, because everybody knew how old this woman, is. And I just kind of said to myself, the math ain't mathin', kind of jokingly, kind of not, like I'm kind of chuckling a little bit, because I realize, yeah, this doesn't line up. But, when the game is older than you, the game is older than you. And so at the time I had gone to say something, and they had flagged me down, because they were like, well, how old were you when the game came out? And I was like, I don't know, like 14. And so we were sitting there and we were kind of just laughing at it a little bit, and I realized, yeah, a lot of these people are fucked up from the neck up. And so I had started researching a fair bit, because I was like, am I the only one that has this issue? And I had realized very quickly that it was a commonplace problem. Lying was a commonplace problem, treating people like shit was a commonplace problem, it's treated a lot like an old boys club, which I never really cared for. And the funny thing is they were sitting there, what had really kind of racked my brain a little bit is they were sitting there and they were talking about how, they didn't really like inclusivity in games, and it had kind of, at that point, gone straight downhill. And this was mainly predominant amongst the retrospective YouTubers and stuff. A lot of them have very conservative, anti-woke mindsets, whatever the fuck that's supposed to mean, And so it was really, really strange, because they would try to act normal enough in public to not completely give themselves the worst case of social suicide that they had ever seen, but behind closed doors, a lot of them are incredibly regressive and very fucked up from the neck up. So it was really wild to me, because they would sit there and they would try to go and give this air of, I'm not into politics, I'm, just kind of like a neutral party, yada yada, don't care about this, don't care about that. And behind closed doors, it was a very substantially different situation. And then the thing that racked my brain, I think, the hardest is one guy went on a transphobic rant while literally a trans woman was sitting next to him. And nobody was aware that she is trans. And it had blown my mind a fair bit. I'd kind of looked at it and I said, God damn, these people are fucking awful. And then to make matters worse, she had acknowledged the transphobia of it, and you could tell, but instead of being like, hey, that's wrong, you don't do shit like that for the common sense reasons, she just kind of sat there, kept drinking, and didn't say jack shit. Because at the end of the day, a lot of these YouTubers kind of have to go and lean on each other for continued support. So it's like, well, we have this fake friendship, yada, 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 and, rinse, dry, repeat, all that jam, really. Well, all that jazz, really. And so eventually I had realized how bad everything was, and I had started to unplug because I realized that a lot of the community was looking up to these people. Not really realizing, like, they would go and they would idolize these people a lot, I think. Not really idolizing exactly how fucking horrible they are. And, like, it's not even so much the fact that they're horrible people, Like, I've seen horrible people left and right most of my life. It's nothing new. It's not the fact that they're horrible, it's the fact that they take pride in being horrible. You know, they're perfectly okay with it, they relish in it, and it's really fucking awful. Especially when you start getting around to the dude bro mentalities, you know, where you just kind of sit there and say, oh, this is okay, and I think the Resident Evil community also, when it comes to their influencers, also suffers from a very severe case of elitism brain rot. And I never really cared for that too much. I would just go and look at it and say to myself, oh, geez, I have heard so much brain rot the entire time that I was, like, going and, like, fucking mingling with these poor fucks, and it just wasn't really getting any better. The consensus, so when they go and they look at a lot of the older Resident Evil games, it is a clear-cut case of I miss the former things, or trying to shove survival horror into a box, more or less, which doesn't really work. So what was going on at the time is when we were dabbling around, watching the rise of 3D, we were dabbling around in pre-rendered backgrounds a lot because early consoles that were trying to do 3D, they had a very limited hardware spec, and so they couldn't do full-blown environments. Looking back at Silent Hill even, its full-blown environment was quite nice, but it ran at an extremely shitty frame rate, and it also had problems with checkering and dithering and everything else. Like, they literally had to have dithering on full blast just to make it work. And so the garbage quality of composite would literally go and kind of blur it together and stuff, which was fine, but eventually this had leaded, I English real good. This had led to the idea of, oh, well, it was an aesthetic choice. Therefore, if you don't have this aesthetic, well, what we believe to be an aesthetic choice, it's not survival horror. And if it doesn't have tank controls, it's not survival horror. Tank controls and pre-rendered backgrounds are not really so much of an aesthetic. It's not like a specific art direction. Pre-rendered backgrounds can be, if you're trying to harken back to something hard enough, but it typically is not an aesthetic. It was literally how we were coping with early 3D. You know, you would go and you would utilize most of that hardware spec to go and make your models look really fucking good, and then you would go and take the rest of it, and you would have really, really pretty, you know, pre-rendered backgrounds, which is really, really nice. You know, really gorgeous stuff. And then with the argument of tank controls, I always thought that it was rather wild, because with tank controls, everybody's like, well, you know, this is, you know, how they intended it, and so, you know, they literally, you know, it's how the game is meant to be played, and it's like, okay, well, yes and no. And so I would have to explain to people quite often that the reason why we have tank controls is because we didn't have better methods. At all. We didn't. And so it was kind of wild to me, because they would say, well, a part of it being survival horror is, you know, them having tank controls because it enhances the horror. And we have had numerous developers over, like, the last 25 fucking years literally say, no, we used tank controls because we didn't have thumbsticks. We used pre-rendered backgrounds because we did not have enough horsepower to make a fully blown 3D environment. You know, you look at the entire PlayStation 1 era, anything that had a full-blown 3D environment, it looks like shit. And it also functions like shit. And that's okay. That's just how it was back then. But trying to say that, you know, it was a conscious, you know, choice to sit there and say, well, they just wanted that aesthetic. No, a lot of people that worked on PS1 games back then, especially people that worked with Capcom, they were like, okay, yeah, we wanted to do something better. We just didn't have the hardware. This is why Resident Evil 1 was remade. Back on GameCube, they were like, yeah, we can do way more interesting things now with a much higher hardware spec. And so it's just really, really nice for them to go back and do the remakes, but I find the greatest problem with a lot of these influencers is they don't really understand what the fuck it is they're talking about half the time. And it's very embarrassing. You know, oh, tank controls enhances the horror. Meanwhile, we have this developer over here that worked on these fucking games saying, "No, man, we just didn't have thumbsticks. We didn't know how to navigate in a 3D environment correctly. We didn't get thumbsticks until way later, you know, with DualShock controllers and everything else." But when you bring this up, a lot of the influencers don't really like that because it attacks their credibility. You know, like they try to present every piece of knowledge they have as very matter of fact because, you know, they're kind of leaning on that with their fan bases a fair bit. And so we see it with tank controls, we see it with pre-rendered backgrounds, we see it with people trying to defend the dithering of Silent Hill 2, as well as Silent Hill 1, because Silent Hill 2 has a fair bit of dithering in certain spots as well. And so what I would notice with the argument with dithering is they would sit there and say, Silent Hill 1, the dithering just gives it more of a grungish look and it enhances the horror. The dithering is there to give them more processor overhead, more or less. That's pretty much all that is. And then that's also the reason why Silent Hill has its fog. The fog covers up the fact that there is a ton of shit rendering in the background, popping in. And again, that's okay. It's one of the tricks that developers would use back then to try to make these old games run, because while the PlayStation 1 was pretty goddamn revolutionary, it wasn't, you know what I mean? Like, it wasn't capable of doing a huge amount of shit like what we would see with, like, the PS2, the PS3, you know? Like, early 3D was really fucking rough. And then we had, even in the PS1 era, we still had a ton of 2D games coming out because people weren't really sure how to go about doing 3D. And again, that's great. You know, like, there was a lot of games released during that era that were just really gorgeous to go and play and look at and everything else. Just, I really loved the 90s for what it was. But no, we would literally go and have a lot of influencers go and kind of present this as matter of fact, and it would just be one bullshit lie after another bullshit lie after another bullshit lie, and it wasn't really getting any better. It just wasn't. And so after realizing this for a really long time, I had started to unplug, because I realized it was just one lie after another, people doing awful things. It had solidified my belief that anybody that is an influencer probably shouldn't be trusted with much of anything. And so I had, you know, I've kept that mentality for a while, and it has actually served me well. Every time somebody's called out for being scummy, I just kind of smile a little bit, and I kind of keep to myself. But no, I've heard, out of that specific community in general, I've heard people go and laugh about how people get upset when, you know, they go and certain aspects of the Resident Evil franchise are discussed. I've heard entire fucking full-blown conversations about how they're upsetting spaghetti that Jill Valentine in the Resident Evil 3 remake was no longer wearing a tube top and like a super slutty, you know, skirt and stuff. And it's like, you go and you look at it and you just kind of say to yourself, is this really what the fuck you're whining about? You know, so it's just really just kind of strange watching these people go and like trying to converse amongst themselves, and every now and then they would just be like, oh hey, what do you think? I kept my mouth shut very, very fucking quickly. The day that I had decided to leave, the day that I decided I was just kind of done with the community as a whole, was when I was sitting down. I'd been on HRT for a really long time, and I was doing okay with passing and stuff. And then, of course, you know, somebody was trying to set up Resident Evil on PC, and it wasn't really going over well. And so what had happened at that point was I was mailed, and I replied back, and they had requested a phone call. And I said, well, you know, are you struggling that bad with it? And the answer apparently was yes. So I said, not a problem. And I went ahead, gave them my Discord, and I had placed the call, and the guy's response was, oh, well, hello, sir, how are you? And at that point, I think I had been tired of being disrespected for like a while. And so I just kind of sat down and I said, hi, bud. I hope you're doing well today. You know, I'm an intersex woman, more or less. I've got a mix of characteristics. And as soon as that had flown out the door, more or less, news had spread very, very quickly about it. And it was one of the few times in my life where I had kept my existences separate. Because when they figure it out and stuff, it gets very, very hateful very, very quickly, and you really kind of have a tendency to see the worst in people, you know, and it had gotten very, very, very shitty, I think. And so at that point, I had literally just kind of retreated from everything. I still make patches and stuff, but I no longer, like, I still have people that invite me to go and hang out and stuff, but after seeing how they go and behave and how they treat one another and how they treat a lot of the people that would be considered fans, I really just didn't want anything to do with it, and that's okay. I got tired of the elitism, I got tired of them not really understanding what the fuck the intent of the technical limitations were at the time, especially on PlayStation 1, after so many developers had come forth and openly explained it. I got tired of people essentially trying to behave like the authority on what these games are and are not. You know, like, it had just kind of, it had really, I think, past a certain point, had pegged me as a bunch of maladjusted adults that never really finished growing up. So they latch on to something that they absolutely love because there is nothing for them outside of that. There's no human being, almost. And it was really, really strange for me, because I was just kind of sitting back looking at this, and, you know, I can understand being a fan of something, right? Like, I go and I listen to anime, and I patch my favorite old games and stuff, and I dabble in emulation, you know, like, I just dabble in so much shit. I can understand going and loving something to the point where you want to keep it alive, but when you sit there and you say to yourself, you know, oh, this is like the only thing in my life, it just kind of says, yeah, okay, bud, you got some issues, I get it. You know, like, it really just kind of echoes that, I think, a fair bit. I can understand doing homages to music, I can understand going and wanting to talk about story and various other facets, but if there is nothing for you outside of just discussing your favorite game, then you really just haven't advanced in life that much. And it kind of makes me disappointed because, yes, I do love these two franchises immensely. Silent Hill a little bit more than Resident Evil because it tells a much better story. But I think past a certain point, you know, there is other things to go and look at. You know, there's other things to go and say, oh, hey, this occupies my time and it feels really, really nice, you know. And I think with a lot of the influencers, they kind of missed that memo. They don't really know how to function outside of it, and they do, like, they do this thing where they think that franchises are just always going to be there and always going to be ongoing, and a lot of the time, they're not. You know, they do eventually end. There's only so much lore, there's only so much gameplay, there's only so many... There's only so many days that it's going to be around. You know, there's only so many installments of the game. You know, there's only so much that you can discuss, and that's why a lot of the time fandoms change. You know, like, you take on new fandoms as time goes on, sometimes. And it eventually does end. So I was really, I think, just kind of disappointed with my experience as a whole. Just kind of sitting down, looking at these people, looking at how they behave and stuff, and it had hammered home the point of you just really cannot fucking trust anybody on the internet, like, at all. You just can't even trust people in general anymore, and it's a very depressing realization, I think. So I was really disappointed by the elitism. I was disappointed at how people would kind of go and latch onto this shit, and it would be a real huge turnoff for new fans, because it was like, well, you know, if you don't like this, if you don't think like what we think and feel like what we feel, you're not welcome here. And I just really fucking hated that mentality a lot, you know, because, you know, if the franchise is ongoing or maybe it's lost and rediscovered, you're always going to have younger generations that pop in and they're going to want to learn about it. Maybe they're going to want to be a fan of it. You know, you don't really know. And so the problem that I see with a lot of influencers is that they try to act like they're the authority on it. Long story short, they're not. If we really had to go and point out who the authority on it is, it would have to be the devs, because the only people who actually really truly know the intent is the developer. You know, how come we have tank controls? Oh, we didn't have thumbsticks. Oh, okay, how come we have pre-rendered backgrounds? Oh, we didn't really have a lot of overhead on the PS1, so we did that so we could make sharper models and stuff. You know, and it's really wild how a lot of these influencers that we see are incredibly pretentious. You know, and it's really, really wild how they kind of, in many ways, just sit in an echo chamber around people that behave just as badly, sometimes worse than them, and then proceed to think that it's alright. You know, to sit down and just be like, oh, it's okay to think like this, it's okay to go and act like this and everything else. And so past a certain point, I was like, yeah, these influencers aren't jack shit, you know, and I just kind of said, let's go ahead and get the franchise back to where it belongs. In the hands of the gamers, the actual core demographic, not the influencers that are making a buck off of it, you know, and trying to bleed people dry, just the base grade gamer that loves the game, has fun with the game, and most importantly, needs a hand with the game. So I withdrew eventually. I was like, okay, you know, this is what we're doing. I didn't want to be around the various forms of baggage anymore. I just didn't want it. I didn't need it. It was wild, the amount of bullshit that these poor bastards are saddled with. And I just kind of sat back and said, yeah, if this is who the community's looking up to, the community's fucked. And a lot of people didn't like that. You know, they don't really like it when you sit down and say, yeah, by the way, this guy that you go and you watch religiously and you try to jerk off religiously, they're a piece of shit. And they don't even like it. Like, it gets worse when you bring receipts, you know, because, like, people will sit there and they'll defend these people up until the day they die. They're like, no, they're good, and so you'll bring receipts. You won't even edit any of it. You'll just bring receipts, and people will sit there and say, oh, well, you just don't want people to enjoy things. No, I just really got tired of people looking up to shitty people. And that's really where the fuck that benched for me. I got tired of people latching onto a video game, making it their entire fucking personality, going and trying to make money off of the community that keeps that franchise alive, and then sitting there and proceeding to shit the bread. Damn, man. Shit the bed. That speech impediment's gonna be the fucking end of me. Shit the bed with every breath they take. Well, they could be shitting the bed with every breath they take as well. I don't know. But no, I just thought it was really kind of sad after a while, and I would just go and look at it, and I would eventually say, yeah, there's more than this. There's more out there than this. I didn't want to hang out with people that I kind of viewed as low quality. You know, that looked down on other people, made fun of other people, that were racist, sexist, homophobic. I understand that the horror community in general kind of has these tendencies, because I love horror games in general, but it seemed a bit excessive, and it just wasn't something that I wanted anymore. And that's quite alright. I'm comfortable with it. I got tired of, you know, a lot of the community just being straight up weebs, you know, literally sitting there like a bunch of white people thinking that they're Japanese people trying to move to Japan and everything else, failing to understand, you know, that they're fetishizing the culture. You know, like, it was definitely a deeper pipeline I think, especially with Resident Evil, because people are like, I'm a Resident Evil fan, I'm going to live in Japan one day. And I would go and I would watch entire conversations unfold over that. And what they don't realize is the way that they were looking at it is extremely disrespectful. You know, like they go and they see a country pop out a couple of cool games and stuff and they want to be all over it. They fall in love with it. I get it. But instead of just saying, hey, you know, they had made a cool game and that's it, they kind of go and they correlate their favorite thing with that country. So what would happen is I would also see a lot of influencers go and either try to move to Japan or try to act Japanese, and it was just really fucking cringy. Like, I really hated that shit. I was sitting down looking at this crap unfold saying to myself, oh man, we can do better. we can definitely do better and stuff. And it's really weird because I notice a lot of the Resident Evil community kind of has that problem, and it's really weird to like go and actually acknowledge it because it insinuates that something is wrong. But a lot of these people would literally, they go and make their money going and hawking this content. They don't understand that, you know, you can appreciate a culture and its contributions without fetishizing every little thing that it does. And so I would see it with, because a lot of these content creators would also go and do cosplay and everything else, and it was just really, really strange for a while. It was a very strange space to be in. But no, it literally, the rabbit hole with it, I think, goes so fucking deep that I would literally be sitting here for literal hours just talking about it, like how fucked everything is in that neck of the woods. And that's not something that I really want to do, in all honesty. It's very depressing watching, you know, these people go and pull this shit, and it's just not something that I appreciate, I think. So I eventually withdrew. And people would still pop around and say, hey, can I get a hand with this? I would just simply say, I would love to, but I'm busy. Eventually, they would stop featuring our chats and stuff, which I was completely fine with. Like, once I said, hey, the gravy train is done, I don't really want to be affiliated with this, people had stopped keeping in touch and everything else, and I was completely fine with it. I was kind of going and reclaiming my peace a fair bit because I didn't want to be around people that had behaved like that. I didn't want to be around people that were scummy in general. You know, the whole anti-woke, you know, this is some woke mind virus shit that we're having to deal with. I'm tired of, you know, all this crap, and I just didn't want to be around that. I got tired of fans being insulted. I got tired of them joking about, you know, various things that were, well, not really worth joking about a fair bit. I had literally become sick and tired of being sick and tired. I literally got tired of influencers for this demographic literally going and thinking that just because they enjoy it, you know, they want to go and live in Asia and try to be Japanese, and it was just really fucking strange to me. You know, like, the amount of fetishization that actually goes on with it is mind-numbing at times, and I didn't really like that. You know, I was kind of hoping that someday they would be like, oh, hey, you know, I've got, you know, this thing that I enjoy, and I appreciate the culture. They gave it to me, but it's wrong to go and fetishize it, and they would just kind of miss the cue entirely. You know, they would miss that entire fucking social cue. And so I had friends, well, I still have friends that live in Tokyo and stuff, and they hate it. They hate it when they get influencers that fucking move over there, just straight up Caucasian people that literally try to go and be super traditional in Japanese society. And so they go and they complain about it a fair bit, you know, and it's just really wild to me. But yeah, that's why I kind of withdrew from the Resident Evil community as a whole, because I would notice these patterns and I'd notice it would kind of come on strong. And past a certain point, I would literally say, you know, this really just is not okay, more or less. And the fetishization of everything was super fucking weird, super cringe, and I just remember kind of looking at it and going, "Oh dear God, this is awful." You know, and there's a difference between learning to appreciate something or having a natural appreciation for something versus just trying to take that something and ram it straight up your ass for your own gratification. It's just really fucking weird to me.
Trick or treat! Come get some!
I think with the Silent Hill community, it's actually kind of a little bit of a difficult thing to talk about on why I left it, because with Silent Hill, the franchise in general is very, very personal to me. I had enjoyed what Resident Evil had set down, right? I enjoyed that pop-style horror with super cheesy dialogue and everything else, but with Silent Hill, I think I had mainly enjoyed it a lot more because it was a more cerebral experience. It was willing to go and tell a really good, really questionable story without any sort of restraint. You know, they didn't really care who they offended back then, and I think a lot of that comes off in the content delivery that they have in place for it. Silent Hill was a lot like Resident Evil in the fact where I was wanting to go and keep the games alive for a while. I would give it the same treatment that I had given the PC ports of Resident Evil, just going and trying to issue the occasional patch here and there. The engine that all the Silent Hill games is built off of is very, very quirky, back when we still used proprietary engines for games, especially ones that had rolled out of Japan and stuff. And so going and looking at it and going and trying to patch it was rather labor intensive a lot of the time. I would have to say that Silent Hill 2 was the game that I'd worked on the most, because it is, I know that people like 3, but I like 2 the most. I like James as a character. I find a lot of the shades that kind of flow out of him to be very relatable with depression and everything else, you know, is just a character I felt that was very realistically written, and a character that I had come to appreciate as time had gone on. So when people started losing access to the PS2, I kind of said to myself, okay, if we're going to go and have these games for a whole new generation, that, you know, we would have to go and keep them alive on PC. And this became even more kind of important, I think, because there was the ushering in of HD TVs and stuff, and then the retirement of, you know, RCA jacks, and not a lot of people wanting to actually go and get an upscaler to be able to go and, you know, play these games, you know, like RetroTink wasn't a thing yet, and, you know, it just wasn't something that people were able to go and do, so I would spend a lot of my time going and patching these games privately, of course, going and sharing with friends, having them run through it, giving me feedback, things like that, bug reports, and I would constantly kind of go and hammer it out and hammer it out and hammer it out, and I would go and I'd fix issues with dual core processors and hyper-threading and just a whole multitude of things. And, you know, the Silent Hill franchise meant that much to me. But much like the Resident Evil franchise, I think the Silent Hill franchise in general, the community in general for that franchise was kind of taken over by influencers and stuff, and I was very, very disappointed with it because the Silent Hill community, I think, at the time already had enough issues. There was already a lot of misinformation being spread around about the game in general and how it functioned and things like that, and I was very, very disappointed, I think. There was a lot of misinformation about the story as well, and, you know, a lot of fan theories, and it was really weird because at the time we had a fresh generation that was growing up on Xbox 360 and stuff that was coming in and wanting to play these games, and with the HD collection being so goddamn bad, me going and patching the PC port was starting to go and ramp up a fair bit. And so we would literally go and have these newer generations go and want to play these games. The HD collection was really, really bad, but what they would do is they would be interested in the game, they would go to the community, and there would be a lot of misinformation right off the bat. A lot of the newer folks going and saying, oh, hey, well, the fog is there because they thought it was creepy. The fog is there because it was established in the first game to cope with the loading and offloading of textures in the environment. The fog literally would go and obscure it. It's also why the damn game is so damn dark on top of it, because they didn't want you seeing buildings popping up in the background. If you want an example of this, all you have to do is go and play Silent Hill 2 on the HD collection, and you can very, 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 very easily see where you can very easily see where a lot of the buildings end. Like, they had fucked with the fog so hard that you can see where all the buildings end. You can see where the static image for the back of Toluca Lake begins. You can see where power lines end. You can see where some enemies go and spawn in. You can just see all sorts of shit. And so a lot of people don't realize that there was a lot of technicality behind the fog. It was there for a reason. And another myth that I would hear a lot of the time in the Silent Hill community is, oh, the game has tank controls because it makes the game more horrifying. And that wasn't really the case either. Silent Hill 2 had been in production for a while, and it came out very, very quickly after the PS2 had dropped, and we were still using, because of the PS1 and how the PS1 operated without thumbsticks, they were still in the habit of making games like that. All the survival horror games were kind of slow to adapt, I think. So you literally had the ability to walk around with tank controls and everything else, and it wasn't there to enhance the horror or anything like that. It was literally there because that's how we were engineering games back then, and Silent Hill 2 had been in development for a hot minute. It did a good job, I think, going and utilizing the hardware that the PS2 had, especially with like the pressure-sensitive buttons and stuff, and I really appreciated that for what it was, and I still do to this day. Although I haven't played it on PS2 in quite some time, I've been relegated to the various PC ports and stuff. So it was literally one of those things, and the community was very, very cancerous past a certain point, revolving around influencers that would go and do retrospectives and stuff that would try to hawk this completely and utterly wrong information, and I would just kind of sit back and I would go and I would look at it and I would say, well, that's not correct at all. That's not okay. And I would eventually get kind of tired of it. Another thing that I really just kind of hated is the fact that the Silent Hill games really have a tendency to bring all the creeps out. And I would see that with a lot of the influencers as well. Like I would still get around a fair bit, helping influencers go and get the game set up and stuff, especially with like patching and everything else and a little bit of uprising here and there. And I was relatively disgusted by a lot of it for the simple fact that a lot of people behind closed doors were actually very, very scummy. Especially when it had revolved around characters like Angela, which, if you haven't played the games yet, spoilerinos, but Angela had a history of molestation and sexual assault, and quite a few influencers that were trying to cling on to me at the time to get the game running would actually, it was mostly the guys, they would actually think that it was a little bit hot and stuff. And so, like, you have this grown-ass woman, that literally is kind of childlike due to stunted development. And it really was kind of gross how they would just kind of sit there and, have this belief that, there's something hot about somebody that is traumatized. And I didn't really care for that too much, I think. I would just kind of look at it and say to myself, God damn, this is pretty fucking disgusting. And so with Silent Hill, I think, given the content that it has, it's not like Resident Evil. It gets very dark very fast. And it really had brought out some of the worst people. And the weird thing is on the surface, they would, like, look normal, right? But when you would get them in a private room, or if you would go and say, hey, we have, this, and this person going and hanging out, I found that entire groups would kind of be infected with this mindset, per se. And then another kind of problem that we had with Silent Hill as well in regards to influencers is they would try to hawk this idea of elitism, where they would go and they would say, hey, I go and, I run a retrospective for these games and I know how they work and what the developer, was going with and, what their intent was. And we would have a lot of Team Silent in the background go and correct various aspects of it. Most notably the fog, where people would be like, oh, well, we didn't throw it in because it was creepy. We threw it in because we were constantly loading and offloading things, from the disk all the time, and we had a ton of stuff going and piling up in the background, popping in, all that jazz. And so we kind of obscured it with a fog effect, and that's how we were making it work on PS1. And then another thing that I think that I didn't really care for too much when it came to a lot of influencers was that they would kind of sit down and say, oh, well, this monster means this, and then the developer would literally go and correct them on Twitter, but they would still act like the de facto standard a fair bit, which is not great, because you're literally having a member from the team go and correct you, and you would still kind of persist on and on and on with it, and it was actually really, really bad, I think. It'd become a very stressful thing past a certain point. And then you combine that with various other aspects like influencers going and fetishizing traumatized characters and things like that, or even incredibly bad takes where they would go and kind of joke about some characters going and dying in very awful ways, especially when you were going and looking at Downpour, how there was a quest in there that you could do where a mentally handicapped child is literally led off of a pier via a ribbon system where it's like keep walking until you see this ribbon sort of thing. And they would go and they would joke about it, and they would say a lot of the time some truly out-of-pocket bullshit, how they thought it was kind of funny and how they'd never deal with a kid like that. And a lot of the time I would just kind of sit and listen. I wouldn't really say anything. I would just kind of sit and listen. I would say to myself, dear God, these people are fucking awful. So a lot of this stuff would kind of just, a lot of this toxicity and shit would eventually just kind of drip down into the community, and then the community itself would start to carry it. And so Silent Hill and Resident Evil, I think, in terms of their toxicity and their problems with proper representation by influencers, had literally gone hand in hand for a really long time, and I didn't really care for that too much. Resident Evil, I think, was more alive and well past a certain point. Like we would get routine releases, and the franchise, for the most part, always stayed pretty healthy. And then you would have Silent Hill, where it's like the first 3 games are bangers, 4 is okay. Homecoming is alright. Origins, out of all of the Western titles, Origins is probably my favorite. And then Downpour was just fucking bad. The one on Vita was okay. It wasn't the best. It wasn't really the worst. So you would just kind of go and watch this steady degradation as time would go on and stuff. And I think past a certain point, I had fun patching the games. It was actually a heap of fun. I got to learn a lot of stuff. And, I was glad to go and keep those characters alive a fair bit by keeping them accessible to newer gamers that wanted to play them on PC. But past a certain point, I just kind of would look at a lot of the influencers and say to myself, dear God, these people are fucking awful. They're laughing at sexual assault and everything else. And I remember just kind of going, looking, squinting a little bit and saying to myself, dear fucking God, what is this? It's not something that happens too often, but it does happen. You know, like I appreciate Silent Hill for what it brought into the horror scene with it being psychological horror, which is just kind of like a subset of survival horror, I think. And I appreciated the stories and the monsters and just the amount of depth that Silent Hill has. You know, I loved all of it from top to bottom, and I was incredibly grateful to be able to
Keep your eyes on
play
the
them
skies.
when
They're
they
coming
rolled
in.
out on their respective consoles, you know, and I was really, really happy with that, I think. But in terms of representation and stuff, I think that it has a tendency to really attract truly creepy people, which I wasn't really that much of a fan of. You know, I didn't want to be around people that were laughing at sexual assault and people killing themselves and just, you know, every single dark aspect of Silent Hill. And so, past a certain point, I had abandoned the project in its entirety because the more that I'd worked on the project, the more that I had realized very, very quickly that it was going to literally bring me the wrong kind of attention, and I didn't want to be around people that were like that. I didn't want to be around people that think that sexual assault's funny and that, you know, going and having traumatized characters is hot, like, you know, having a mental illness is all of a sudden fashionable. And I would go and I would look at it and I would say to myself, yeah, we can't really go and be doing these things more or less. It's not really the standard that I want to have in place. And so I had eventually stopped patching the game. Everybody had gotten pissed off, especially the influencers, because they're like, I'm having a hard time going and running this game in widescreen, and, you know, when's the next patch coming? And eventually I just realized that I didn't want to be around these people because they're extremely fucking sketchy, as most influencers have a tendency to be. And so I would just say it's not, you know, it's nothing showing up. I'm going to go ahead and leave the project in other people's hands. And I kind of quietly said to myself, okay, if these other people want to sit there and deal with these people, that's fine. They're more than, you know, welcome to. But it makes no sense for me to sit there and say, oh, okay, you know, I'm gonna go ahead and complain about the problem while going and still managing to be a part of it. I didn't like that at all. It was truly awful to me, I think. You know, just the kind of stuff that a lot of these people would go and laugh at was just truly awful. And then during meetups and stuff, it was the standard shit that I would go and see over in the Resident Evil community of just a lot of homophobia, sexism, transphobia, all that. And I just kind of said to myself, you know, we need better representation for our community because we have way too much sketchy shit going on. We have an influx of new fans that just want to come in and just enjoy this franchise for what it is, you know, because it's like Silent Hill and Resident Evil have a tendency to go hand in hand. You know, Resident Evil is more like your pop horror, and then Silent Hill is way more cerebral. It's one of those games that you sit down and play when you want to think. And so for me, Silent Hill was more of a personal experience, right? You know, it had fundamentally changed how I viewed people as a human being. You know, I would go and I would look at the games, and I found that as I played the games, I generated more empathy. You know, like I could literally go and look at these characters, and, you know, aside from all the horror bobs and bits, I would say to myself, oh wow, these characters have truly seen some shit. And so I think when it came down to going and patching the games and stuff, I was way more passionate about it. I mean, don't get me wrong, I love Resident Evil, right? But I absolutely adore Silent Hill and what it brought to the table because it did more than Resident Evil, in my opinion. So, past a certain point, the community at large had become so toxic and stuff, with all of it dripping down from the influencers, that I had just kind of said to myself, I really just don't think that this is okay. This is never going to be okay. These people are going to be fucked up from the neck up, and there's no way in hell that I can actually go and salvage it. I cannot, salvage it at all. I cannot save it at all. This is not okay. And the weird thing is a lot of people would go and worship these people. They would go and look at these influencers, and they would think that they're normal and one of them. And it had, up until that point, reminded me of of the dangers of parasocial relationships and stuff. With me, I don't really get terribly starstruck or anything like that. I don't get super excited when a celebrity walks up to me. I just go, hey man, how you doing? High five, and that's pretty much it. Because I am relatively boring in that regard. So I would go and I would look at how a lot of the time these people were worshipped, and I would just kind of say to myself, in the back of my mind you, my god, these people are fucking awful behind closed doors, and yet people still adore them. I said, holy shit, ignorance is bliss. And so past a certain point, I'd be invited back, for meetups and stuff, and I would start dodging it like the plague. Because I just didn't want to be around that. I felt that, when it comes to being an influencer, there's like a certain level of social responsibility, And a lot of these influencers, they just want the fame, but they don't want any of the responsibility that comes with it. And that is really, really awful to me, I think. So I would go and I would think about all these things, and I would think about all the racism and sexism, and a lot of the times it would be treated like an old boys club. It's like, oh, you look at them very quickly and you realize, oh, they are those types of gamers, I think we've all sat down and had that realization where, you go and it's like, okay, well, we have these awful franchises, we have horrible people fucking latching onto the community, so you go and you look at them, and it's normally the whole, with Silent Hill, from what I had noticed, it was like the whole anti-woke bullshit, and I just kind of sat down and I would go and I'd look at it and I'd say to myself, Jesus fucking Christ, really? And it was always really weird when we would have the anti-woke crowd go and latch onto games like this, because they would be like, this is back when games were good, and, like all this other shit, and when they didn't tell, sugared and watered down stories and everything else. And the weird thing that a lot of the influencers that have done retrospectives about these games and stuff is they don't really ever realize that Silent Hill was very, very progressive for the time. Mainly Silent Hill 2. Silent Hill 1 was okay. Silent Hill 2 is really where we started seeing it be fleshed out and stuff, because we didn't have, due to its taboo nature, we didn't really have a lot of games back then covering topics of rape, incest, molestation, suicide, murdering your significant other. Like the list really just kind of goes on and on and on. Bullying, that wasn't something that was covered, in games and stuff. And so it's really, really weird when, when a lot of these influencers would just kind of sit down and say, oh, well, we don't like all this, woke crap. And, it's really weird watching them go and say this when Silent Hill was one of the few games at the time, well, more specifically 2, that was covering subjects that were so damn taboo that no other game had literally gone and covered it. Not in a tasteful way. Like Silent Hill 2 literally goes and it covers thoughts of suicide, depression, murdering your significant other, dealing with complex trauma, dealing with loss, dealing with suicidal ideation, dealing with sexual assault. Like, the list with Silent Hill 2 and 3 is literally so fucking expansive that it is unreal. And so I always just kind of laughed when people would be like, there is no agenda, for any of these games, and that's why they're good. And so people would go and they would open their mouths, and I would always kind of laugh a little bit because they would always go and complain about agendas. But at the time, they were trying to say, this game doesn't have an agenda, but when you go and you look at, like, a lot of the interviews for Team Silent and stuff, they would ask, a lot of the time, a lot of the people would ask them, why did you include this character? And they would simply state, oh, we wanted awareness. There is not enough representation for people like this. And it seems fitting. So you have representations of people that are mentally handicapped. You have representations of those that are depressed. You have representation of those that have been sexually assaulted. You know, it just goes on and on and on and on and on. Simply because the developed Team Silent literally wanted to have a certain level of inclusion. They wanted everyday people that experienced real world problems. And that is something that Resident Evil really never did correctly until games way later on down the track. And so I always thought it was like really strange how a lot of the anti-woke crowd, you know, the dude bros would go and latch onto it and stuff, forgetting exactly how progressive the Silent Hill games were for the time. And it really just kind of throws me on my ass a little bit because they go and they whine and they complain, you know, modern gaming is awful and oh, agendas and all that. But we literally, with Silent Hill 2 and 3, we have character agendas. But the thing is that they're so well written that you don't really ever notice it, and that's what really makes it great, I think. But no, the community's just been kind of eating itself the last while. A lot of the content creators are literally going and showing their transphobia. There was one guy I was watching, he literally went and, like, he does retrospectives and stuff, and he was like, yeah, well, you know, I want to talk about Angela Gate and you know, and how they made her look, because he was literally sitting there and apparently he didn't really care for the fact that Angela has a little bit of a bigger jaw. So he's like, you know, I would expect this jawline to be on like a 40-year-old linebacker. And I'm just kind of sitting there going, you know, women do have jaws like this, dude. They're mainly European, but they do have jaws like this. And so I would go and I would look at it a fair bit. And I would say to myself, Jesus Christ, dude, these people are just kind of going and showing a fair bit of sexism and a fair bit of transphobia. And, you know, it's just the same shit that we've seen in the community for the last while. And then he later on had pointed out, he's like, oh, it's just a bad scan. It's okay. And they had literally gone, and the developer had literally gone and pointed out that the jawline was not a mistake. It wasn't a misscan or anything like that. It was literally there because they wanted Angela to have a more round, more full face compared to the model that she had. But when you go and you look at all the models for the Silent Hill 2 remake, you know, they all have little tweaks and tunes to them and everything else. You know, like they're not all one-to-one when you actually bother to stop and, you know, actually pay attention to the work that they've done and stuff. So it was actually really just kind of sad, you know, because I feel like a lot of the influencers, when it comes to this community, that you just really cannot trust them with jack shit. But the problem with Silent Hill is that it's not even so much the game itself, it just has a tendency in a way to go and kind of attract a sketchy demographic. But regardless, I was very disappointed by what I saw. However, I was not surprised. And so I would sit down and I would just go and kind of look at it a fair bit. And, you know, I just kind of said to myself, you know, the community deserves better. You know, like Silent Hill is an amazing fucking franchise and I'm enjoying watching it make a comeback. But at the same time, I look at it, I realize that a lot of these people are extremely fucking sketchy. They have a tendency to hang out in big ass groups and shit. And so the mentality is commonly shared. You know, in many ways, I feel like the well for the community has been pretty heavily poisoned, and that's kind of sad because there was a point in time where the community was actually very, very wonderful, and I do miss that a fair bit. However, with this modern community that we have and with all the influencers that have been latching onto it and stuff, it's just been one sketchy thing after another, and then to make matters worse, a lot of these poor fuckers are trying to go and weasel their politics in on it as well. You know, I don't like this, I don't like that, oh, I don't like, you know, like they literally go and they whine about it and stuff, but the only thing that they're doing really is showing that they're not really capable of any form of advancement, I think. it's just really, really sad how people go and just kind of complain about it. And, like they claim that a lot of the time when you go and you look at influencers like this, they claim, oh, I'm politically neutral or I'm neutral on this subject, but you sit down and you let them kind of flap their gums a little bit, and then they like really start showing you who they are and stuff. But I don't really see any sort of, I don't really see, in all honesty, any sort of real kind of neutrality and stuff because all they're doing at that point is masking. They're trying to hide their overall view of it, especially with Angela Gate and everything else. It was just really fucking obnoxious because they were very quick to make some of the most transphobic and sexist jokes I think that I've ever seen. And so the problem that the Silent Hill community has is not generally the type of game they play, it's the type of people that latch onto the community that tries to represent us as a whole. And it's really just kind of sad, I think. And that's something that I have cared for, the last while. It's just fucking awful, I think. So yeah, I don't really consider myself a part of the Silent Hill or Resident Evil communities anymore. I kind of just sit down and say to myself, oh geez, things have gone astray. I used to really enjoy these games, and now both of their communities, due to YouTube, are infected with so much fucking brain rot that there's literally nothing left. And so instead of latching onto the community, continuing my projects and stuff, I have largely retired both, handed them off to what I would deem as way better people, and I have literally just been enjoying the games by myself because I honestly feel like you cannot really trust any of the goddamn influencers with much of anything. And a lot of that has bled down to both communities as a whole. So that is going to be a wrap for why I, no longer associate with the Resident Evil and Silent Hill communities. Little bit of a interesting mailbag, I think. So, for those that have come out and given me your time and your effort and all that awesome stuff, I greatly appreciate it. And until next time, please always remember to be good to yourselves and each other. Thank you so much. Take care.